What would you do if the only shelter you could afford was one the world had condemned? If your only inheritance was a ruin, and your only welcome was the scorn of those who had cast you out? For 19-year-old Annie Coldwell, the purchase of the derelict Blackwood Almshouse for a single dollar was not a choice, but a last resort, a final stand against the cold indifference of the world. But what lay sleeping within its rotting timbers was a truth that would awaken an entire parish, a secret of greed and grace buried for a generation. Settle in and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight. The cartwheel dropped into a rut with a heavy, liquid groan, jolting Annie Coldwell from a stupor that was not quite sleep. She blinked, the gray, damp air of a Norfolk afternoon clinging to her face like a shroud. Oakhaven. The signpost had said so a mile back, though the village itself had been slow to appear, emerging from the flat, waterlogged fields as if reluctant to be seen. Old Thomas, the carter, clicked his tongue, and the weary horse strained, pulling the cart onto the cobbled market square. It was empty save for a few chickens scratching in the mud, and a woman pulling a bucket from the central well. The woman stared, her expression as blank and unwelcoming as the shuttered shop fronts. Annie felt the weight of her few possessions behind her, a small trunk containing her mother's worn Bible and 2 patched dresses, a roll of bedding, and a small crate with a kettle and a handful of tin plates. It was the sum total of a life abruptly dismantled. A memory, sharp and hot as a branding iron, surfaced. The face of her former master, Mr. Gable, his jowls trembling with sanctimonious rage. Thief, he had called her, holding up a missing silver locket she had never seen before. The other servants, her friends just an hour before, had looked at the floor, their silence a wall she could not penetrate. No one had spoken for her. She had been dismissed without a reference. Her name blackened, her future erased. The injustice of it was a hard, cold stone in her stomach. It had happened just a month after her father's death, a good and simple man who had worked the same patch of earth his entire life. His passing had dissolved her last tie to the world she knew, leaving her adrift until the Gables had taken her in, a brief charity that had curdled into accusation. Now she was truly alone. "This is as far as I can take you, lass," Thomas said, his voice a low rumble. He was a friend of her father's, a man whose kindness was etched in the deep lines around his eyes. He had offered to bring her and her things to Oakhaven for a price she could not pay, and had accepted her promise of future work instead. She slid down from the cart, her boots sinking into the soft mud. The air smelled of wet earth, coal smoke, and something else, something stagnant and old. Thomas began unloading her meager belongings, placing them carefully on a dry patch of stone near the market cross. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who had spent his life lifting heavy things, including the burdens of others. When he was done, he pressed a small, lumpy sack into her hands. "Potatoes," he murmured, avoiding her gaze. "And I found this in the barn." He held out a thick wool blanket, faded and smelling faintly of hay. Tears pricked at Annie's eyes, but she would not let them fall. "I can't pay you, Thomas," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Hush now," he said gruffly. "Your father was a good man. That's payment enough." He climbed back onto his seat, the wood creaking under his weight. He looked at her one last time, his expression a mixture of pity and a deep, abiding respect. "Be strong, Annie. That's all there is." He flicked the reins and the cart rumbled away, leaving her standing beside her small pile of worldly goods in the center of a village that had already decided it did not want her. The silence it left behind was vast and profound. She clutched the deed in her pocket, the paper thin and fragile as her hopes. It was the only reason she was here, the last desperate gamble of a girl with no other options. The Blackwood Almshouse, a name, a place, a ruin, and now her only home. She took a breath of the cold, damp air and held it, a small act of defiance against the crushing weight of her new beginning. Annie gathered her shawl tighter and walked toward the one building that showed signs of official life. A small stone structure with a slate roof and a freshly painted sign that read, Parish Office. Inside, a clerk with ink-stained fingers looked up from a ledger, his gaze incurious. A large man in a waistcoat too tight for his burgeoning middle stood with his back to a small coal fire, warming his hands. He turned as she entered, and Annie found herself looking into a pair of small, shrewd eyes set in a fleshy, florid face. This was the parish warden, Mr. Silas Croft. Yes? He asked, his tone suggesting she was an interruption he would not long tolerate. I've come about the almshouse, Annie said, her voice small in the quiet room. She held out the preliminary agreement she had received by post from a solicitor in Norwich. The Blackwood Almshouse. I'm here to pay the final sum and take the deed. Croft took the paper from her, holding it at a distance as if it were contaminated. A slow, supercilious smile spread across his face. He chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. You're the one, he said, looking her up and down, taking in her worn dress, her tired face. The fool, I confess. I was curious to see who would throw away good money on that heap of stones. The clerk snickered, then quickly bent his head back over his work when Croft shot him a glance. It's a ruin, girl, Croft continued, his voice dripping with condescending pity. Fit for rats and rot and little else. The last of the paupers we tried to house there died of lung fever and misery more than 20 years ago. The place is cursed, if you ask me. Leaks like a sieve and smells of death. He seemed to relish her discomfort, to enjoy painting the bleakest picture possible. But a deal is a deal. He gestured to the clerk. Draw up the final deed for Miss Coldwell, Annie supplied. Her chin held a little higher. Annie Coldwell. For Miss Coldwell, Croft finished, with a mock bow. He walked back to the fire, turning his back on her, as the clerk scratched away with his pen. The transaction felt like a performance of humiliation, and she was the unwilling star. She stood in silence, her hands clenched at her sides, listening to the scratch of the nib and the crackle of the fire. She felt the weight of the parish's scorn settling upon her shoulders, a heavy, invisible cloak. Finally, the clerk sanded the fresh ink and pushed the document toward her. The payment, Croft said without turning around. Annie reached into the small purse tied at her waist. Her fingers closed around the single, heavy dollar coin she had saved for this moment. It was one of the last she possessed. She placed it on the counter. The sound it made, a dull, final clink, seemed to echo in the room. The clerk swept it into a drawer. Croft turned, a final smirk playing on his lips. There. You are now the proud proprietor of the finest ruin in Norfolk. May it bring you all the joy you deserve. She folded the deed, the paper stiff and official, and placed it in her pocket. It felt heavier than the coin she had given up. She had bought a ruin, a tomb, a place of sorrow, but it was hers. In a world that had taken everything from her, she had this one wretched thing. It was a start. She turned and walked out of the office, not looking back, her head held high against the tide of his silent, mocking laughter. Was this an act of foolish desperation or quiet faith? What secret was so terrible it could empty a house of charity and leave it to rot for a generation? Let us know your first thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for the rest of Annie's story. Now, with the deed in her hand, she had to face the ruin she had bought. As Annie stepped back into the muddy square, the door of the parish office closing behind her with a definitive click, she felt as if a verdict had been passed. The whispers she imagined were now real. Two women by the well stopped their conversation to watch her pass, their heads close together. A man loading barrels onto a dray paused, nudged his companion, and nodded in her direction. Bought the old misery house. She heard one of them mutter, the words carried on the damp air. A fool and her dollar are soon parted. From the window of his office, she could feel Silas Croft's eyes on her, his contempt a palpable force. She did not look back. She gathered the handles of her trunk and began the slow, arduous task of dragging it towards the lane that led out of the village. Her progress was slow. The trunk was heavy, and the muddy ground seemed to suck at her boots and the trunk's corners. She had to stop every few yards, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her arms aching. It was during one of these pauses, as she leaned against the cold stone of a garden wall, that a voice, thin and reedy as a winter bird's, cut through her exhaustion. "You'll be the new one, then." Annie looked up to see a very old woman sitting on a small wooden bench just inside a cottage gate. Her face was a fine web of wrinkles, a roadmap of a long and difficult life, but her eyes were startlingly clear and alert. She was wrapped in a thick, dark shawl, her hands, gnarled with age, resting on a wooden cane. "The one for the almshouse," the old woman clarified, her gaze steady and unblinking. It was not a question. Annie nodded, unsure what to say. "Yes, ma'am." The old woman, who the village knew as Elspeth, leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. She seemed to look straight through Annie, to a place or a time far beyond the present moment. For a long moment, she said nothing, simply studying the young woman before her. Annie felt a strange sense of being weighed and measured, but not with the scorn she had felt from Croft. This was something else, something deeper and more ancient. They took the blankets. Elspeth said at last, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "They took the pots, they took the cross from the wall, but they were fools. They left the heart of it." She paused, her eyes clouding with memory. Then she fixed her gaze back on Annie, and the look was so intense it felt like a physical touch. "The beds remember," she said, the words falling into the silence with the weight of stones. Before Annie could ask what she meant, the old woman leaned back, her eyes closing as if the effort of speaking had drained her. She seemed to have retreated back into her own world. Annie murmured a quiet, "Thank you," though she wasn't sure what for, and picked up her trunk again. The words echoed in her mind, nonsensical and yet strangely significant. The beds remember. That evening in the village tavern, the Plough and Harrow, Silas Croft was holding court. He stood near the fire, a tankard of ale in his hand, his voice booming through the smoky room. "A slip of a girl, no more than 19, he declared to the assembled farmers and laborers. Paid her last dollar for it, she did. I told her, I said, that place is a tomb, but she wouldn't be warned." He took a deep swig of his ale, wiping the foam from his lips with the back of his hand. "Mark my words, she'll come crawling back before the first frost, begging the parish for a bed, and I'll be there to remind her of her foolishness." A ripple of cruel laughter went through the room. The men, their own lives hard and unforgiving, found a dark comfort in the story of another's misfortune. Annie Coldwell's name became a punchline, her desperation a source of evening entertainment. The story cemented her status as the village fool, an outcast whose failure was not a matter of if, but when. She, meanwhile, was still dragging her trunk down a darkening lane, utterly alone, with only a cryptic phrase from an old woman to keep her company. The lane that led to the Blackwood Almshouse was less a road and more a suggestion of one. Two deep ruts carved through a field, overgrown with weeds, and flanked by skeletal hedgerows that clawed at Annie's dress as she passed. The half-mile from the village felt like 10. The sky, which had been a uniform gray, was now darkening to a bruised purple at the edges, and a cold mist was rising from the damp ground, swirling around her ankles. With every step, the sounds of the village faded, replaced by the hoot of an owl and the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. She felt as if she were walking off the edge of the known world, and then she saw it. She rounded a bend in the lane, and the almshouse materialized from the mist as if by some grim magic. It was worse than she had imagined. Far worse. Croft's description, which she had taken for cruel hyperbole, was simply the truth. The building was a long, low structure of gray stone, but the stone was slick with a lurid green moss, and dark water stains ran from the roofline like tears. The roof itself sagged dangerously in the middle, a great sway-backed beast on the verge of collapse. Most of the windows were boarded over. The few that weren't were jagged, black holes. A single, skeletal chimney stood sentinel against the darkening sky. The entire structure seemed to be sinking into the soft earth, surrendering to the slow, inexorable pull of decay. The gate hung from a single hinge, and the path to the door was choked with nettles and brambles. A profound wave of despair washed over Annie, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. This was not a shelter. This was a grave. The single dollar she had paid felt like a fortune squandered. Her last hope turned to ash. As she stood there, frozen by the sheer hopelessness of it all, a movement near the crumbling doorway caught her eye. A dog. It was painfully thin, its ribs starkly visible beneath a coat of matted gray fur. It had one cloudy, blind eye, and it held its right front paw off the ground as it watched her, its head cocked. It didn't bark or growl, simply stood there, a fellow outcast, as broken and derelict as the building it guarded. That night she could not bring herself to go inside. The black, gaping doorway felt like a mouth that might swallow her whole. She found a corner on the stone porch that was partially sheltered from the wind by a collapsed section of wall. She unrolled her bedding, the thin mattress a poor defense against the cold stone, and wrapped herself in the blanket Thomas had given her. She ate a raw potato from the sack, the starchy grit a poor substitute for a meal. As she huddled there, shivering, the dog limped cautiously towards her. It stopped a few feet away, lowered itself to the ground with a pained sigh, and laid its head on its paws. It watched her with its one good eye, a silent, shared vigil in the encroaching darkness. Annie named him Barrow, for the mound-like feeling of the place. Together, two forsaken creatures, they listened to the old house groan and settle around them, the wind whispering through its broken bones like a long, sorrowful sigh. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with dreams of falling. The next morning dawned cold and clear, the pale sun doing little to warm the air, but serving to illuminate the full extent of the almshouse's decay. Annie, stiff and sore from a night spent on the stone porch, knew she could delay no longer. Taking a deep breath, as if about to plunge into icy water, she pushed open the heavy oak door, which scraped protestingly against the floor. She stepped inside. The air was the first thing that struck her. It was a physical presence, a thick, heavy blanket woven from the smells of a generation of damp, of rot, of rat droppings, and of something else, a faint, lingering scent of human sorrow. Dust motes, thick as insects, swarmed in the thin shafts of light that pierced the gloom from cracks in the boarded windows. The entry hall gave way to a single, long dormitory that ran the length of the building, and there they were, the beds, 6 of them, 3 to a side, standing like grim, skeletal sentinels in the gloom. They were simple, brutally functional things, crafted from thick, dark oak that had gone almost black with age. The straw-filled mattresses they must have once held were long gone, rotted away or carried off, leaving only the bare frames. Everything else of any conceivable value had been stripped from the room. The fireplace was empty, the mantelpiece gone. Even the iron hooks on the walls had been pried out. Only the beds remained, too heavy and too plain to be worth the effort of stealing. Annie walked slowly down the aisle between them, running a hand over the dusty surface of one of the headboards. The wood was cold and slightly damp to the touch. She felt a strange sense of reverence, as if she were in a tomb. These were the beds where the forgotten poor of Oakhaven had slept, and, according to Croft, where they had died. She shuddered, a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. She continued her inspection, her practical mind trying to assess the scale of the damage. As she ran her hand down one of the thick, square corner posts of the last bed on the left, her fingers snagged on something. She stopped and looked closer. It was a join line, a faint seam running vertically down the post. At first she thought nothing of it, But then she realized it made no sense. A post like this, meant for strength, would be carved from a single, solid piece of timber. A seam suggested it was two pieces joined together, or that it was hollow. It was an anomaly, a detail that refused to fit the logic of simple, sturdy furniture. She pushed on it, but it was solid, firm. She tried to find a purchase with her fingernail to pry at the seam, but it was perfectly flush. Her curiosity piqued. She moved to the next bed and the next, examining each one in turn. Every single one was the same. Each of the 6 beds had one post, always the one at the foot of the bed on the right-hand side, that bore the same faint, inexplicable vertical seam. It was a deliberate pattern, not a flaw but a feature. A sudden vivid memory of the old woman, Elspeth, sitting on her bench, her eyes sharp and clear. The beds remember. The words, which had seemed like the ramblings of old age, now echoed in the silent dormitory with a sudden, startling resonance. Annie didn't understand. She couldn't begin to guess what it meant. But as she stood there in the dusty gloom, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she had just found the first question in a very large mystery. The days that followed blurred into a routine of relentless, back-breaking labor. Annie's first priority was survival, and that meant making the almshouse even marginally habitable. She began with the roof. Using a rickety ladder she found in a collapsed outbuilding, she climbed up to the sagging swayback. She spent hours clearing away years of accumulated leaves and debris, then carefully, painstakingly, replaced the most shattered pieces of slate with whole ones she scavenged from the fallen sections of the roof. It was dangerous, terrifying work, but with each slate she laid, she felt a small flicker of ownership, of victory against the decay. Down below, Barrow, her silent companion, would watch her, his one good eye tracking her movements. He had decided to stay. He never strayed far from the almshouse, and had taken to sleeping on the porch just outside the door. A self-appointed guardian. When Annie spoke to him, his tail would give a weak, hesitant thump against the stone, a small acknowledgement of their shared solitude. He was a constant, quiet presence in her world of silence and hard work. Inside, she waged a war against the dirt. She tore down the rotting boards from the windows, letting light and air into the stagnant dormitory for the first time in decades. She swept out layers of dust and filth, the clouds she raised so thick she had to tie a rag over her face. Then came the scrubbing. With a stiff, bristled brush she had found, and a bucket of water from a nearby stream, she got on her hands and knees and began to scrub the stone floors. Her hands, already calloused from a life of service, became red and raw, but she didn't stop. With every clean flagstone that emerged from beneath the grime, she felt she was scrubbing away not just the building's neglect, but her own despair. All the while, the beds dominated the room, too heavy for her to move. She was forced to work around them, and as she did, her mind kept returning to the strange, seamless joins on their posts. The mystery of them was a low hum beneath the noise of her daily toil. One afternoon, while scrubbing the floor beneath the bed in the far corner, her brush snagged on something caught in a crack between the flagstones. She put down her brush and worked the object free with her fingers. It was a small, triangular piece of metal, dark with tarnish. It looked like the tip of a custom-made key or winder, designed for a specific, unusual lock. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She stood up, wiping her wet hands on her apron, and went to the bedpost with the vertical seam. She tried to insert the metal tip into the hairline crack, but it wouldn't fit. Disappointment washed over her. She ran her fingers over the wood again, pressing and probing. Then she thought to examine the very bottom of the post, where it met the floor. There, almost invisible under the grime, was a tiny keyhole, no bigger than the head of a pin, and it was not round but triangular. With trembling fingers, she inserted the metal key. It was a perfect fit. She turned it. There was no loud click, just a faint internal snick. A sound she felt more than heard. She pulled the key out and pressed on the seam again. This time there was a slight give. The seam widened by a hair's breadth, enough to admit the edge of a fingernail. It was locked from the inside, but she had just unlocked the outer catch. Her hands were learning the secret that her mind had not yet fully grasped. The house was speaking to her, not in words, but in wood and stone and metal, and the language was one of patience and labor. The discovery of the key and the tiny lock changed everything. The low hum of curiosity in Annie's mind grew into a clamoring demand for answers. The next day, she gathered her meager collection of tools, the hammer she'd had in her trunk, and a rusty iron pry bar she had unearthed in the overgrown yard, its end flattened into a crude chisel. She chose the bed in the darkest corner of the dormitory, the one she had worked on the day before. It felt the most secretive. Barrow seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. He whined softly from his position by the door, his one good eye fixed on her, his body tense. The air in the almshouse was still and heavy, the afternoon light slanting through the newly cleaned windows, illuminating a universe of dancing dust. Annie took a deep breath, the pry bar feeling cold and heavy in her hands. She wedged its tip into the hairline crack she had managed to open. She pushed. Nothing. The old oak, seasoned by centuries and settled by decades of neglect, was stubborn. It was as if the wood itself had taken a vow of silence. She repositioned the bar, trying to find a better purchase. She put her shoulder into it, her muscles straining. A low groan came from the wood, a sound of protest that echoed in the silent room. She pushed harder, her knuckles white, sweat beading on her forehead and running into her eyes. Barrow whined again, a higher, more urgent sound. She put her full weight into the effort, her feet braced against the stone floor. There was a sudden, violent crack, a sound like a bone snapping that made her jump back. It was shockingly loud in the stillness. A long splinter of oak flew past her head. The seam had given way. A section of the thick, square bedpost, about 3 feet long, hung open like a door. It was not solid. It was a hollow shell, expertly carved and fitted to conceal its nature. And the space within was not empty. Her hands trembled as she reached inside. Her fingers brushed against coarse canvas. She pulled, and a small, heavy sack, dark with age and stained with mildew, came free. It was tied at the neck with a leather thong. It was far heavier than it should have been. With fumbling, clumsy fingers, she worked at the knot. It gave way, and she tipped the contents into her palm. A glint of yellow, then another, then a cascade of soft, buttery light. Gold. Not 1 or 2, but a whole handful of sovereigns, their weight solid and real in her hand. The face of a long-dead king staring up at her. She stared, her mind unable to process what her eyes were seeing. She reached back into the hollow post. There was another bag, and another, and another. 6 bags in total from that one post. A fortune. But there was something else. At the very bottom of the cavity, nestled in a bed of dry, rotted linen, was a flat, rectangular object wrapped in oiled canvas. She pulled it out. It was a book, a ledger bound in dark leather, the cover embossed with faded gold lettering. She carefully unwrapped it, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She opened it to the first page. The calligraphy was elegant, precise. The Blackwood Endowment Register, it read. Established Anno Domini 1782. She turned the pages, column after column of careful accounting. Donations, investments, expenditures on food, blankets, and medicine for the poor of the parish. It was a record of a century of charity. Then, about 25 years ago, the entries began to change. They became sparse. The donations continued, but the expenditures dwindled to almost nothing. Finally, she reached the last few pages. The handwriting changed. It was a spidery, cramped script. It recorded a series of large, regular withdrawals. Each entry was dated, and each was signed by the same man. His signature, a self-important scrawl she recognized instantly. Silas Croft, parish warden. The truth, cold and hard and undeniable, was laid bare in the flickering light of the dusty dormitory. He hadn't just let the almshouse fall to ruin. He had bled it dry. He had stolen the hope of the poor, coin by coin, and hidden his crime in the very beds where they should have found rest. That night, the sky broke. A storm which had been gathering unseen on the horizon rolled in over the flat Norfolk landscape with the speed and fury of an avenging army. The wind rose from a whisper to a howl in a matter of minutes, rattling the old window frames and tearing at the loose slates on Annie's newly patched roof. Then came the rain. Not a gentle shower, but a torrential, driving downpour that hammered against the almshouse, as if trying to beat it back into the earth. Inside, Annie sat at the single rickety table she had managed to repair. The glittering pile of gold sovereigns and the damning ledger spread before her. The flickering light of her one candle cast long, dancing shadows that made the room feel alive and menacing. The sheer scale of the discovery, of the crime, was overwhelming. This was not just a few stolen coins. It was the lifeblood of a charity, the trust of a community, embezzled over decades by a man who smiled at her in contempt. As the storm raged, the house began to fail. A drip started in the far corner, then another, closer to her. Soon, a steady trickle of black, sooty water began to run down the wall directly above her table. Panic seized her. The ledger. The ink was old, but a direct stream of water could blur it, ruin the evidence, make it all for nothing. She scrambled to move everything, shielding the precious book with her own body, her heart pounding with a new kind of fear. This was no longer about her own survival. It was about protecting the truth. She wrapped the ledger back in its oilskin and tucked it, along with the bags of gold, into her small, dry trunk. Just as she had secured it, a frantic, desperate pounding began at the main door. Nearly lost in the roar of the wind and rain, her first thought was Croft. Had he somehow found out? Was he coming to reclaim his stolen hoard, to silence her forever? She froze, her hand on the lid of the trunk, her blood running cold. But the voice that called out was not his. It was a man's voice, thin with desperation. "Hello? Is anyone there? Please help us." Hesitantly, Annie unbarred the door and peered out into the maelstrom. In the brief, strobing light of a lightning flash, she saw a terrifying scene. A small cart, its axle snapped, was mired in the mud of the lane. A man was trying to soothe a terrified horse, while a woman huddled over a small child, trying to shield them from the deluge. They were travelers, caught unawares by the storm's fury. In that moment, Annie faced a choice. She could keep door barred, protect her secret, and let them fend for themselves. Or she could open it. Without a second's hesitation, she chose. She pulled the door wide. "In here," she shouted over the wind. Quickly, she helped the shivering woman and crying child inside, then stood aside as the man followed. His shoulders slumped in defeat and gratitude. She barred the door behind them, shutting out the storm. The family, soaked to the bone and trembling with cold, looked around the bare, grim interior. Annie had nothing to offer but shelter, but she gave what she had. She gave them her driest blankets, the ones she slept in. She shared the last of her bread and the few potatoes she had left, boiling them in her kettle over a small fire she built in the long dormant hearth. She gave them the driest spot on the floor, while she took the damp corner for herself. In this simple, profound act, she unknowingly reconsecrated the Blackwood almshouse, breathing life back into its original purpose. She was no longer just the owner of a ruin. She was its steward, and its first act of charity in a generation was hers. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived. The next morning dawned bright and scoured clean, the sky a brilliant watery blue. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. Inside the almshouse, the mood was transformed. The traveling family, whose names were John and Mary, were overwhelmed with gratitude. John, a carpenter by trade, was aghast at the state of Annie's roof and the broken axle on his cart in equal measure. "It's the least I can do, miss," he insisted. After eating a breakfast of boiled potatoes, You gave us shelter when any other would have bolted the door. Let me see to that roof properly, and perhaps you could lend a hand with my wheel." And so an unlikely partnership was formed. As John, with Annie as his willing apprentice, began the expert work of mending the roof, with scavenged slates, a visitor appeared, walking up the lane. It was the village vicar, Reverend Hale. He was a tall, slender man with a gentle, scholarly face, and his expression was one of polite concern. "Good morning," he called out. "I heard from the smithy that a family's cart had broken down on this lane last night. I came to see if I could be of assistance." He arrived to a scene that must have surprised him. Instead of a derelict ruin, he saw a place of quiet, purposeful industry. He saw a man confidently working on the roof, and a young woman, her face smudged with soot but her eyes clear and determined, passing slates up to him. He saw a mother and child, warm and dry, sitting on the porch in the morning sun. The almshouse was alive. Annie saw the kindness in his eyes, the genuine concern that was the polar opposite of Silas Croft's sneering contempt. In that moment, she made a decision. After ensuring John and Mary were settled, she quietly asked the vicar to step inside. She did not offer a long, convoluted story. She knew it would sound like a fever dream, the desperate ravings of a poor, half-starved girl. Instead, she let the evidence speak for itself. She led him to the table, and from her trunk she retrieved the leather-bound ledger and a single, heavy bag of gold coins. She opened the book to the final pages, the ones filled with Croft's spidery signature, and pushed it toward him. Then she untied the bag and let a cascade of gold sovereigns spill onto the table, the coins shining in a beam of sunlight. Reverend Hale stared, his face a mask of disbelief. He picked up a coin, turning it over in his fingers. Then his gaze fell to the ledger. He began to read. Annie stood in silence, watching his face. She saw his initial confusion turn to dawning comprehension, then to a grim, sorrowful anger. He looked up from the book, his eyes meeting hers. He looked at the stark poverty of the room, at the leaking ceiling, at the thin, worn dress of the young woman standing before him, and he understood. "The Blackwood endowment," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We all thought it was simply gone, that the investments had failed." He slowly closed the book. "Mr. Croft has been parish warden for 30 years. He looked at Annie, his expression one of profound respect. "Miss Coldwell," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "you have uncovered a grievous wrong." That afternoon there was no public spectacle. Reverend Hale, accompanied by 2 stern-faced churchwardens, paid a visit to the parish office. The door was closed. Passers-by reported hearing no raised voices, only a low, intense murmur from within. An hour later, the 3 men emerged, their faces like stone. Some time after that, Silas Croft walked out of his office. His face was the color of ash. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in an hour. He did not go to the tavern. He went straight to his home, and the next morning, before the sun was fully up, a cart piled high with his belongings was seen leaving Oakhaven, heading west. He was not arrested, he was not tried. The scandal, the vicar had decided, would do more harm to the parish's faith than good, but he was gone, humbled, broken, and erased from the life of the village he had systematically bled dry. The townspeople, seeing their powerful warden so utterly vanquished, began to look at the old almshouse and the quiet girl who lived there in a completely new light. In the weeks that followed, a quiet miracle unfolded on the edge of Oakhaven. The story of Annie Coldwell and the almshouse beds spread, first in whispers, then in open conversation. The mockery turned to awe, the scorn to a deep and abiding respect. The restored Blackwood endowment, now under the careful stewardship of Reverend Hale and a newly formed parish council, a council on which Annie herself had been given a seat of honor, began to work its magic. Workmen arrived at the almshouse, their wages paid from the very coins that had been stolen from it. The sagging roof was straightened, the stones repointed, the windows glazed. The interior was plastered and whitewashed, The long, grim dormitory partitioned into smaller, more private rooms, each with a new bed, simple but clean and warm. The almshouse was not just being repaired, it was being reborn, better and stronger than before. It was becoming a true sanctuary, its purpose renewed, its spirit rekindled. News of the story traveled beyond Oakhaven. People from neighboring villages, and even from as far as Norwich, began to make their way down the once-forgotten lane. They came not to mock, but to see the place for themselves, to witness the quiet triumph of integrity over greed. Some came with donations of their own: a side of bacon, a stack of warm blankets, a collection of books for a small library. The village that had once cast Annie out now embraced her, and the wider world, hearing her story, embraced her too. One evening in late autumn, as the sun began to set, casting a long golden light over the fields, Annie stood in the doorway of the nearly finished almshouse. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Barrow, no longer a limping stray, but a healthy, glossy-coated companion, sat beside her, his head resting contentedly on her knee. She scratched behind his ears, and his tail thumped a steady rhythm against the new doorstep. Reverend Hale walked up the path, a quiet smile on his face. He stood beside her for a moment, looking at the transformed building, at the warm light spilling from its windows. "It is truly a remarkable thing you have done, Miss Coldwell," he said softly. "You have rebuilt more than just walls." Annie looked not at the house, but out at the fields stretching away to the horizon, the land her father had loved. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the false accusation, the lonely road, the ruin that had become her salvation. She thought of the gold, not as a treasure she had found, but as a responsibility she had been given. She had come to Oakhaven seeking only a roof over her head, a place to exist. She had found a place to belong. She turned her gaze back to the warm, welcoming light of the almshouse. "A house is not a home," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the twilight stillness, "until it has a purpose. Thank you for joining us on this journey, to the heart of what it means to build a life of meaning." That's the power of quiet determination. If Annie's story moved you, we hope you'll leave a like and a comment below. Be sure to subscribe, as there are so many more stories of lost things finding their way home, waiting to be told.